Hello, and welcome to the version 2.0 play primer for my Elder Dragon Highlander deck, Dysphoria Syndrome. Before we begin with the primer, I'd like to point out that the artist of the deck's general, Circu Lobotomist, has recently been diagnosed with cancer, so this video is being dedicated to both Cyril Hagen, link to fundraising in description, and to Wedge from the Mana Source, who is currently raising money for St. Jude Children's Hospital via a live stream, and who once said during a Dies to Removal podcast with the professor from Tolarian Community College that Circu was one of his picks for worst general due to the irrelevance of his third ability. Now then, let's take a walk into the Undercity, shall we?
People who wander into Ravnica's Undercity might encounter agents of House Demir. Sometimes those people must be made to forget what they have seen. Circu Lobotomist is happy to remove memories that need removal. Dysphoria Syndrome is an Elder Dragon Highlander deck featuring Circu Lobotomist as the general. Do you want to not care how much life your opponents have? Do you want to play a combo mill deck in Elder Dragon Highlander? Do you love House Demir? If you answered yes to any of the above, this deck is for you. Circu himself is a 2/3 blue and black human wizard that has 3 abilities. Whenever you play a blue spell, exile the top card of target library. Whenever you play a black spell, exile the top card of target library. And your opponents can't play spells with the same name as cards exiled by Circu Lobotomist. Notice, Circu targets the library, not the player, so Ivory Mask and Leyline of Sanctity cannot protect your opponents from Circu. Also, his third ability, though not often relevant in EDH, can have impact, such as the time I hit a Shadowborn Apostle in a deck featuring 40 of said card. In those instances, you may laugh. Let's begin with the deck now. First, I will go over all the cards in the deck, and then I have a segment on how to use the Demir signature mechanic Transmute to get best value when tutoring for cards. Traumatize is our first card. It puts the top half of target player's library into their graveyard. It's reliable, single-target milling. Not often good in multiplayer, as much as so in two-player games, but it will deal with a pesky opponent. Just be warned, because it does not exile. If someone has a graveyard strategy, you may enable them more than you hinder them. Mind Funeral puts cards from the top of target player's library into their graveyard until they hit 4 lands. Another reliable single-target mill card. Mind Grind is as Mind Funeral, but until they hit X cards. It's more expensive than Mind Funeral for low numbers of cards, but better than Mind Funeral at high values of X. Psychic Drain puts the top X cards of target player's library into their graveyard, and you gain X life. It can be a pick-me-up boost if somebody is aggro against you and targeting you with lots of damage. Increasing Confusion again mills the top X cards of target player's library. This has flashback, and if you flash it back, mills 2 X cards. Dire Undercurrents is an enchantment that has, whenever a blue creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player draw a card. Whenever a black creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player discard a card. This can be used to force your opponents to discard and you to draw, or perhaps force them to discard and then draw. Memory erosion. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. This enchantment will make people less likely to play less likely to play any spells, because when you have to mill 2 cards for every spell you play, you'd better make it count. Jace's Erasure. Whenever you draw a card, you may have target player put the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. It's great with all of our card draw we have. We're in blue, obviously. And it works well with Dire Undercurrents. You can force yourself to draw and them to mill and discard. Mesmeric Orb. Whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. Notice it says permanent, not non-land permanent. So people will be very careful in casting big spells if they know they will have to mill 6 or 7 cards next time their untap phase occurs. Untap step. Pardon my language. Altar of the Brood. This is the Ugin's Fate promo version. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Now we have the Paran of House Demir, Sadak, Lord of Secrets. He's a 5/5 flying vampire that if he would deal combat damage to a player, instead prevent that damage, put that many +1/+1 counters on Sadak, and that player puts that many cards from the top of their library into their graveyard. Mirko Vosk, the Mind Drinker, is a 2/4 flying vampire that, when he deals combat damage to a player, they have to exile cards from the top of their library until they reveal 4 land cards and put them in their graveyard. He's basically Mind Funeral on a stick. The pre-release promo Consuming Aberration is a star, where star is equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards, and whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals cards from the top of his or her library until they reveal a land and put those cards in their graveyard. He's great for just an alternate win condition for destroying your opponent or opponents one at a time. Great Dreamborn Muse. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts the top X cards from their library into their graveyard, where X is the number of cards in their hand. People can start milling their library very quick when Dreamborn Muse is on the table. Jace's Archivist is a windfall on a stick. Each player discards his or her hand, then draws that many cards, or draws the number most discarded. So, for example, if one person discarded a full hand of 7, everybody's going to get 7. Ambassador Laquatus. Target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard for 3 mana. So you can use him to mill, and mill more. Dimir Guildmage has 2 abilities. For 3 and a blue, target player draws a card, and for 3 and a black, target player discards a card. So you can get some good mileage out of him, or millage, as it were. The Duskmantle Guildmage has 2 abilities as well. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere this turn, that player loses 1 life for 1, a blue, and a black, or for 2, a blue and a black, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So if you're going to mill a lot of people, you may want to activate Duskmantle Guildmage first, so you can also kill a lot of people. What would a combo deck be without tutors? So we have Increasing Ambition, 5 mana to search for 1 card, put it in your hand and shuffle your library, or flash it back for 8 mana and search for 2 cards, put them in your hand and shuffle your library. Demonic Collusion is another 5 mana tutor. This one has buyback, discard 2 cards. You can search your library for a card, put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. And if you pay the buyback cost, you'll get back your Demonic Collusion, ready to do it all again. Diabolic Tutor is a 4 mana tutor. Just lets you search for a card, put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. Merchant Scroll is from Homelands. It costs 2 mana, and it lets you find blue instants and put them in your hand, then shuffle your library. So you can find 1 blue instant. Long-Term Plans is a tutor which lets you search your library for a card, shuffle your library, and put that card 3rd from the top. Limdual's Vault lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library for 2 mana. As many times as you choose, you can pay 1 life, put those cards on the bottom of your library in any order, then look at the top 5 cards of your library. Then shuffle your library and put the last cards you looked at this way on top of it in any order. Parallel Thoughts is a card I don't see too many people running, but I like it. It's 5 mana. It lets you search for 7 cards, shuffle them, and set them aside in a face-down pile. Then shuffle your library. And whenever you would draw a card, you can instead draw from the face-down pile of 7. The obvious problem being if someone disenchants Parallel Thoughts. So, don't put all your eggs in one basket. But it's a handy basket to have. I won't go over what to transmute these next few cards for now, as that's at the end of the video. This now is just their main functions. The Ethereal Usher transmutes for 6. She has blue and tap. Target creature is unblockable this turn. And she is a 2/3. Netherborn Phalanx is also a 6-cost transmute. When he enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life for each creature they control. So if somebody's having a token strategy or just generally lots of creatures on the board, this 2/4 horror will really punish them. Brain Spoil is a 5-cost transmute that destroys target creature that isn't enchanted. It can't be regenerated. Clutch of the Undercity is your 4-cost transmute. You can return target permanent to its owner's hand. Its controller loses 3 life. Perplex is a 3-cost transmute. Counter target spell unless its controller discards their hand. So they have to decide between having a hand or having a spell. Demure Machinations also costs 3. You can look at the top 3 cards of target player's library, remove any number of those cards from the game, then put the rest back in any order. Drift of Phantasms is a Defender Flying 0/5 that also transmutes for 3. Shred Memory removes up to 4 target cards in a single graveyard from the game, and is a 2-cost transmute. Muddle the Mixture counters target instant or sorcery spell, and is a 2-cost transmute. Dimir Infiltrator is a 1/3 unblockable that is also a 2-cost transmute. Dizzy Spell is a 1-cost transmute that gives target creature -3/-0 until end of turn. High Tide makes until end of turn all islands you control produce an extra blue mana when tapped for mana. I've had some people complain about me running a High Tide in my deck, but when they found out I didn't have any High Tide reuse shenanigans or other such things that would let me have a High Tide every turn, they generally rescind those complaints. Caged Sun, you name a color when it enters the battlefield, and creatures of that color get +1/+1, and whenever a land is tapped for mana of that color, you make an additional mana of that color. It costs 6 mana, but it's well worth it. Gauntlet of Power does exactly the same thing as Caged Sun for 5 mana, except it only applies to basic land that produce mana of the chosen color. We need these mana doublers because we have Palancron. He is a member of the infamous Urza block free cycle. He is a 7 mana, 4/5 flying illusion that when he enters the battlefield, untap up to 7 lands. He also has 2 and 2 blue, return Palancron to its owner's hand. Thus, if you can produce 11 mana out of less than 7 lands, or up to 7 lands, you can cast Palancron an arbitrarily large number of times, which will trigger Surku's ability an arbitrarily large number of times, and exile an arbitrarily large number of cards from an arbitrarily large number of libraries. All you need to do is name the integer. If, of course, you can produce more than 11 mana, you also get infinite mana as a beautiful side effect. Cryptghast is another mana doubler. This one only works for swamps, and it also has Extort. Cavern Harpy. When she enters the battlefield, you have to return a blue or black creature you control to its owner's hand, or you can pay a life to return her to your hand. And she is a 2/1 flying. Realm Right, you name a basic land type, and all your basic lands become of that type in addition to their other types. Handy with Caged Sun and Cryptghast and High Tide. Consecrated Sphinx, whenever an opponent draws a card, you draw 2, and it's a 4/6 flying for 6 mana. Rhystic Study, whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. Early game, people generally aren't going to pay the 1, so you'll get some good card advantage. Blue Sun Zenith is X and 3 blue. Target player draws X cards. Shuffle Blue Sun Zenith into its owner's library. It's a good way to get yourself some card advantage, or mill out an opponent whose library is almost gone. Consult the Necrosages is a modal spell. Choose 1. Target player draws 2 cards, or target player discards 2 cards. Train of Thought uses the Izzet signature mechanic Replicate, where you can pay the replicate cost as many times as you like and cast the spell that many times. And it's draw a card for 2 mana. Skyscribing has the Azorius signature mechanic Forecast, where I can pay 2 and a blue and reveal Skyscribing from your hand. Each player draws a card. Play this ability only during your upkeep and only once each turn. And it's X and 2 blue. Each player draws X cards. Now, with a card that makes each player draw X cards, you never want to make everybody draw a number of cards equal to their library with that. Otherwise, all players at the table will lose simultaneously, and nobody wins. Prosperity is also each player draws X cards, but it only costs X and a blue. Fact or fiction: reveal the top 5 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 face-up piles. Put one pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. It's just great card advantage. Frantic Search is another member of the infamous free cycle. Draw 2 cards, then choose and discard 2 cards. Untap up to 3 lands. Induce Paranoia is a counterspell that if you cast it with black mana, the player has to put the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, where X is the converted mana cost of the spell you countered. Recoil returns target permanent to its owner's hand, then that player discards a card from their hand. Cyclonic Rift returns target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, and uses the Return to Ravnica Is It mechanic Overload, where you can pay 6 and a blue instead of 1 and a blue, and return each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. I always suggest players who play blue in EDH have a Cyclonic Rift on hand. It's a nice little reset button. Necrogen Mists: at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player discards a card from their hand. Good way to keep your opponents under control. Dimir Keyrune makes blue mana or black mana, or if you pay blue and black, it turns into a 2/2 black and blue horror creature until end of turn that can't be blocked. The Dimir Cluestone makes blue or black mana, and for blue-black tap and sacrifice, you can draw a card. Dimir Signet filters a colorless mana into a black and a blue mana. And what EDH deck would be complete without a Sol Ring? Now we have the mana base. A Dimir Guildgate, signed by Kathleen from Loading Ready Run at last year's Penny Arcade Expo. Dimir Aqueduct enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand, but it taps for blue and black. Watery Grave is your Dimir Shockland. It enters tapped unless you pay 2 life, and makes blue or black. Salt Marsh is your standard invasion tap land. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it makes blue or black. Frost Marsh is your snow land, which enters the battlefield tapped and makes blue or black. Jawar Isle Refuge gives you a life when it enters the battlefield, but it enters tapped and it makes blue or black. Temple of Deceit is your Scry Temple. It enters tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 1, and it makes blue or black. Creeping Tar Pit enters the battlefield tapped, makes blue or black, and for 1 a blue and a black, it becomes a 3/2 blue and black elemental creature that's unblockable. Dark Slick Shores enters tapped unless you control 2 or fewer lands. It's your Mirrodin, Scars of Mirrodin Fastland, and it makes blue or black. Drowned Catacomb enters tapped unless you control an island or a swamp, and makes blue or black. It's your M10 duel. Underground River makes blue or black, and it's your Ice Age Painland, so it hurts you to do so. Tainted Isle makes blue or black if you have a swamp, otherwise it just makes colorless. Dark Water Catacombs filters a colorless into a blue and a black. Sunken Ruins filters a blue and black hybrid into either blue-blue, blue-black, or black-black. It's your Shadowmoor filter land. Esper Panorama can search for basic islands, swamps, or plains when you tap it and sacrifice it. Grixis Panorama searches for basic swamps, islands, and mountains when you tap and sacrifice it. Polluted Delta is your Dimir fetch land. You pay a life and tap it and sacrifice it to find a swamp or island. Note this is not basic like the panoramas. Dusk Mantle. For blue and black, you can mill the top card of target player's library. This is the Dimir Guild Hall. Nephalia Drownyard is 1 a blue and a black to mill 3 from target player's library. Ghost Quarter, you tap it and sacrifice it to destroy target land, and that land's controller may search their library for a basic land and put it on the battlefield, then shuffle their library. Halimar Depths, when it enters the battlefield tapped, you can look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put them back in any order, and it makes blue. Bojuka Bog exiles target graveyard, target player's graveyard, enters the battlefield tapped, and makes black mana. Cabal Coffers, for 2 and tapping it, you add black to your mana pool for each swamp you control, which obviously can be very boosted with Realm Right. We then have basic land. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 basic swamps, all of which are from Ravnica, City of Guilds. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 basic islands, also all from Ravnica, City of Guilds. That is the deck. Now stay tuned for How to Transmute.
Hello, and welcome to the segment on best making use of Transmute in Dysphoria Syndrome. Transmute is a great tutoring mechanic, but you have to know what cards you have available at each mana cost. Dizzy Spell is our 1-cost Transmute, which transmutes for Increasing Confusion, Altar of the Brood, Prosperity, Sol Ring, Realm Right, and High Tide. Realm Right and High Tide are your 2 most popular transmute targets for Dizzy Spell. However, Sol Ring is good early game, or if you need a card boost, Prosperity is also good. At 2 cost, we have Muddle the Mixture, Dimir Infiltrator, and Shred Memory, which allow you to transmute for Cavern Harpy, Cyclonic Rift, Duskmantle Guildmage, Jace's Erasure, Dimir Signet, Psychic Drain, Mind Grind, Mesmeric Orb, Dimir Guildmage, Train of Thought, Limdul's Vault, and Merchant Scroll. The choices here are more varied, but usually you're going to use this to find Cavern Harpy, Cyclonic Rift, maybe your Signet if you're early game, or if you're in need of some real disruption, your Mesmeric Orb. You won't often use it to find your Limdul's Vault or Merchant Scroll, because they're just other tutoring. However, if there's a larger blue instant you need, and all you have in your hand is Dimir Infiltrator, you can transmute for Merchant Scroll and search from there. At 3 cost, we have Drift of Phantasms, Perplex, and Dimir Machinations, which find our Rhystic Study, Memory Erosion, Jace's Archivist, Blue Sun Zenith, Recall, Dimir Keyrune, Dimir Cluestone, Ambassador Laquatus, Mind Funeral, Necrogen Mists, Frantic Search, Consult the Necrosages, and Long-Term Plans. Your best bets here are either the Memory Erosion or the Rhystic Study, as they'll get you most mileage. However, Sometimes it's a good idea to search for your Blue Sun Zenith or Ambassador Laquatus. It all depends what you need at the stage of the game where you're at. If you absolutely need to search for something else and you only have a 3-cost transmute, search for your long-term plans and go from there. At 4 cost, we only have one transmute card, Clutch of the Undercity. For the most part, you're going to be using Clutch of the Undercity to find your Cryptghast for mana doubling purposes. However, it is also possible to search for Factor Fiction, Diabolic Tutor, and Induce Paranoia. At 5 mana, we have Brain Spoil. Brain Spoil can search for Parallel Thoughts, Gauntlet of Power, Dire Undercurrents, Consuming Aberration, Traumatize, Mirko Vosk, Increasing Ambition, and Demonic Collusion. Your best bet to search here is the Parallel Thoughts, because that will allow you to search for other cards to put under the Parallel Thoughts. If not searching for Parallel Thoughts, I recommend searching for Gauntlet of Power if you're in the position to need your mana doubling to start your combo. If you need something that doesn't cost 5, you can search for one of the 2 tutors. And finally, at 6 cost, we have the Netherborn Phalanx and the Ethereal Usher, which are only good for searching for the Caged Sun and the Consecrated Sphinx. You'll most likely search for the Caged Sun. Anyways, this has been the 2.0 play primer for Dysphoria Syndrome, my Circudemir Lobotomist Elder Dragon Highlander deck. I hope you enjoyed your time spent learning about this deck, and if you wish to construct the deck, you now have the listing of cards for the deck. However, if you wish to play against the deck, I am always down for a good game. Have a good afternoon.